channel. So in this video I'm going to be talking about the Russo-Ukrainian War. We can at least call it a war. If I said that in Russia, it'd be 15 years in prison for one word, for telling the plain truth. So it was Stalin's birthday yesterday, sorry, the anniversary of his death rather, and no doubt he would be proud of his pupil Putin, whose lifetime just overlapped with Stalin's, in that Putin has gone back to the old ways. He's a sawdust Stalin, but all the similarities shouldn't be overemphasized because Stalin was at least an intellectual, and he wrote his own articles, published numerous books on Russian linguistics, which was deeply impressive considering he only had a secondary school education and Russian was a second language. But this war is Putin's temper tantrum. And that's why he's been so irrational. This is a visceral issue with him. He's been feeling and not thinking about this. He's always been evil, but up until now, he's been rational. He's been coldly calculating. He's been very clinical about his every move. In Crimea, he waited for the propitious movement. Then he moved quickly and decisively. Through disinformation, through this hybrid warfare strategy, he was able to befool the world and seize that peninsula, which, morality and legality aside, was a definite gain from Russia. And this time he has miscalculated very badly indeed. The timing of the war and the many more mistakes I'm going to go over. If it had begun in November, he would have had a much better chance. The ground would have been frozen. Oil prices would have been so high during the winter, the European Union could not even have contemplated reducing imports of Russian oil and gas, never mind cutting them off altogether. And now we're in March, the ground is thawing after a relatively mild winter, and so many of his vehicles can't go off-road. By May, it'll all be dried out, they can go off-road, no problem. He could have delayed till May, but he wasn't willing to do that. Of course, the other thing is in May, that people wouldn't have needed his oil and gas supplies so badly. Now, the European Union can reduce or even cut off its purchases of Russian oil and gas at the moment. It's doable, it'll be difficult, it'll be financially painful, but they can at least contemplate it. So this is turning into a fiasco for Russia, which is not to say that they're going to lose. Somewhat depends how you define victory, though. So there was an 8-day delay to the start of the conflict at the beginning, partly because the CIA, they exposed this Russian plot to stage a false flag incident, the kind of thing that Putin has previous on with those apartment block bombings in 1999, where he willfully murdered several hundred of his own citizens in order to justify a new campaign of atrocity against Chechnya. And so they didn't go ahead with that plan, and so they didn't have the excuse they'd wanted to, but and that 8-day delay was also critical. And those soldiers sitting there in Belarus, in Russia, on the border of Ukraine, were using up their fuel to keep themselves warm, were eating some of their rations and their supposed training exercise, then they went ahead, so no wonder they ran out of fuel and food quite early on. So there's been rather poor analysis on Putin's side. They certainly don't do things exhaustively. He was buoyed up by his success 8 years ago in Crimea. His popularity was sky high. It has since fallen, and it's going to take another tumble. He might have thought it would shoot up again, but I mean, far from it. No doubt he'll ban polling organisations from carrying out these surveys soon, because the results will be just so gloomy. He misread Zelensky's psychology. He thought Volodymyr Zelensky in the first plane out of there. To give credit to Zelensky, Zelensky is gallant. He's there fighting. I do wonder whether that's foolhardy. Zelensky's job is to lead and not to fight. If he gets killed, that could be a body blow to Ukrainian morale. Okay, he'll be a martyr, but this Apiothis as a martyr president, I'm not sure that's as useful as a living president. He could be hiding in the forest or something like that. It's probably too late to escape Kiev. He's not actually proved he's in Kiev for quite some time. That video he made that evening, that might have been the last one before he skedaddled out of there, whilst there was still a chance of escape. Anyway, so Putin has misjudged the situation. In this error of judgment, it could prove fatal to his regime in the long run. I don't think it'll prove fatal in the short run. There are regimes like, say, Saddam Hussein's Iraq suffered a very heavy defeat in 1991, and yet he still managed to cling on for another 12 years. It took a full-scale invasion to topple him. So this Kiev, this attempt on Kiev, this attempt on Ukraine as a whole, if it's a protracted conflict, it could turn into something like Afghanistan in the 1980s, which would really drain Russian resources. Remember, Russia is not the Soviet Union, only has half the population of the former Soviet Union, and has very few firm allies. Belarus, that's about it. The Soviet Union had at least a dozen allies around the world. I mean, not just Eastern Europe, like Cuba and so on, countries that are really willing to fight. And Russia's relationship with China is nothing like as cozy or as cordial as Putin likes to pretend. The Russian military shown that's quite disorganized, it's fairly inefficient, but the Russian bear should not be underestimated. It's still something to fear. They've got nuclear weapons. Apparently, their missiles are excellent. I mean, I'm no military man, but I just rely on friends of mine who are in the army, in the Royal Navy, and so on. Putin has had to affirm that it is going according to plan. Well, it's a bit like they say, if you have to say you're a lady, you probably ain't. If you have to emphasize that it is on schedule, then it probably isn't. Why was he impelled to say that? And only 2 days into the war, the Russian government put out an announcement with fanfare that they triumphed. They announced victory. They very quickly retracted that one. They deleted it off all their websites. Why? Because that's absolutely risible. It's far worse than what George W. Bush did about 2 months after the liberation of Iraq. All major combat operations were over, he announced, when he landed on the aircraft carrier. And what was that big banner they had? Was it mission accomplished? Of course, they went on battling there for a further 8 years. Because Putin, he thought that they could seize Kiev straight away, and logistics problems. They tried to seize that airfield, Antonov airfield, just outside Kiev, and they almost succeeded on day one. And had they done so, they could have flown in a lot of supplies. Okay, some of their supply planes would have been shot down, but I mean, I'm surprised they haven't started flying in supplies, because the problem is they're parked on the road down from Belarus, 3 abreast, all lanes full. There is no return lane. You're going to have to reverse back to Belarus if you need. If you drive off onto the fields, you'll sink in the mud in the case of many vehicles. This was so poorly thought through because of the thaw and the fairly mild winter. So they could be decimated by the Ukrainians, who are inflicting some losses on them, but they're not the mighty strokes of war you might have hoped for. So could the Ukrainians even lift the siege of Kiev? I don't think so, actually. Kharkiv, I think that's a forlorn hope. They're just not even going to try. It's impossible. So this is why Putin's had to demand total control of the media, because obviously he fears the truth. The public know that how badly it was going. They would demand an immediate end to the war. If they knew that was not the slenderest justification for his insensate aggression, then they would demand peace. Do I think Putin will stop if he annexes Ukraine or use some excuse to move into other countries like Moldova? Well, great question. If he succeeds, if the price is not too high, of course he'll be buoyed up. He wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. Be very open about that, not in the sense of Marxist-Leninism or the economic system. He's fairly indifferent to economics. He doesn't have any great theory, doesn't care about it. He's a chauvinist, he's a hyper-nationalist, he's an irredentist. It's that simple, really. And that's why some Russian ultranationalists actually began taking the sides of the Bolsheviks in the 1920s, say, yeah, well, it's another way to achieve Russian imperialism. So he'd go on to others. Some of his politicians very close to him have wondered aloud about retaking back Kazakhstan, saying there's no tradition of statehood, just the same rhetoric that presaged the invasion of Ukraine. So Central Asian countries are getting jittery. Bear in mind, some of them, the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, are military allies of Russia. Then there's some Russian ultranationalists, Vladimir Zelensky, that perennial presidential candidate who says we should retake Alaska. So don't think this has no repercussions for the rest of the world. It does. If I were Finnish, I'd be worried, or the Finns will be finished. He's not as brave as he makes out, Putin. Well, exactly. The man is always strutting around in a military uniform, who was never in the military for a single day. When most Soviet boys had to be in the army, there he was busily torturing human rights activists. That was his contribution to the defense of his country. Same with his defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, was never a soldier. I was never a soldier, wouldn't want to be one for 1 second, but maybe that's why I don't wear such a uniform. I mean, I realize Zelensky wasn't and only put on this uniform when the war began. So, anyway, censorship is specifically prohibited by the Russian constitution, and yet they have severe mass-scale censorship. If you publish anything about this conflict that's not from official government sources, that's 15 years in jail. Putin signed that into law the other day. So logistics is a real headache for the Russians. What's that? Well, that is providing what are the necessities of the military in the right place, in the right quantities, at the right time. So that's obviously ammunition, mainly fuel, food, could even be medical equipment, drugs, occasionally spare parts, and also going back the other way, taking back some wounded soldiers or even some prisoners, but that's a lower priority because it's got to be enough ammunition. There's no good providing the ammunition after your unit's already surrendered or something, and it's got to get all the way there. It can't just get half the way there and the soldiers can't use it. Obviously, if they're captured airfields, you'd still have to transport it from the airfield to wherever the front is, but that would reduce the distance considerably. So that this campaign is stuck in the mud, almost literally. So that's why some of these units have run out of fuel, they've got no food, that's why they're looting shops. The Ukrainians aren't using roadside bombs, maybe they've been trained in that. They're not boo-boo trapping the supermarkets where the Russian soldiers are looting, or would that be requisitioning? Perhaps because the Ukrainian civilians might have to just pilfer from these shops as well. I think the economy's broken down, you don't need to pay for anything anymore. A lot of people abandon their houses or shops and things like that. So Russian doctrine has always been about firepower. It's not really speed. It's a slow lumbering giant. It's really just pulverizing the enemy into submission. But apparently Ukrainian air defense is functioning decently. So after 7 days of the conflict, Russia admitted to 498 combat deaths. So they lie about everything, and the true statistic will be considerably higher. I think a conservative estimate for that data would be 100 combat deaths per day. And usually they're 3 wounded for every 1 killed, because of course medical science is so outstanding these days that a lot of soldiers' lives are saved who in former times would have perished. The Russians haven't admitted to a single prisoner being taken, though there's ample video evidence that they have been taken, and in considerable numbers. Some poorly led, very disaffected, demotivated, spotty, whey-faced teenage conscripts have surrendered, and they too are hapless victims of Putinism. Some of them will be innocent dupes of his and believe the propaganda that surrounds them. They've got 360-degree propaganda, radio, television, the internet, posters, and in school, brainwashing children. And yet there's projection from Putin claiming that these ultra-nationalist Nazis in Ukraine have brainwashed people into Ukrainian nationalism. Well, Ukrainian national identity has existed for centuries. It's not a new thing. The Ukrainians were even recognized as a nationality. That was a word in the Soviet era. So Putin has really been imbecilic in his impatience. And one of his intelligence failings, and I don't mean like grey matter, I mean in terms of analysing secret information, is want to believability. Because he's refracted everything through an ideological prism. Is this information or is it disinformation? Well, you've got to put aside all emotion, be completely unsentimental, and analyse it according to objective criteria, and not have your only criterion, is this attractive to me? If it's attractive to me, it's true. If it's unattractive to me, it's false. And so he refuses to be told the truth. He's going to shoot the messenger. He refuses to take on board unwelcome advice, to confront unappealing facts, to face up to obstacles, to time delays, things like that, which is why he screwed up so badly. And so that convoy north of Kiev could be a sitting duck, a very tempting target, but obviously the Ukrainian Air Force is hugely outnumbered, so they can't attack it too much. Otherwise, they would have decimated it, though they have inflicted some losses on it. So more weapons on the way from NATO, but why so slow? I suppose they'd just be put into civilian cars and driven to the front. You know, javelins, those man-portable missile launchers which can take out tanks, or, you know, Stingers which can take out helicopters or slow-flowing aircraft, and some Russian choppers have been shot down. There's video evidence of that. Do you think the Ukrainians will acquire those planes from Poland for their air force? Well, apparently the Poles, Bulgarians and Slovaks refused to hand over those MiG fighters, the very same ones that the Ukrainians used, so the Ukrainians wouldn't need to be retrained, which is a pity. I thought the US might say, if you give those to the Ukrainians, we'll replace them with more modern American-manufactured jets, but that hasn't happened. But it could be shooting fish in a barrel, this immobile column. And if the bridges are blown up, and a few of them have been, how do the Russians get the engineers up to repair the bridge? Well, then other vehicles have to go off-road, get stuck in the mud, and on and on. So Russia's supposed to be an all-weather army because of the extreme weather conditions, the continental climate they work in. But because their vehicles were out in the open for months and they weren't maintained, they're in a poor state of repair, which is why they're breaking down. So they're bombarding Kharkiv, which I would think would fall imminently, and Mariupol, yet another atrocity. So there was a truce declared the other day, civilians could get out, and then the Russian military waited the civilians around the streets and then recommenced bombardment. And the Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed that the ceasefire is over. So what a low-down, dirty trick that was. And that's why Ukraine said, we can't strike a deal with these people. We tried negotiating, but they break every promise they ever made. No matter how solemn, no matter what language is used, they will renege on every treaty. They have broken every treaty. They always perjure themselves. Is Putin lying? Yes, you can guarantee he's lying. Do not believe a word he says. So if we agreed to give him some of our land, he would just break it. He would invade more. I mean, I'm afraid to say the Russian government cheats and cheats and cheats more than anybody else in the world. They have 2% of the world's population, 25% of the world's Olympic athletes caught doping. And yes, Putin claims to be a student of Russian history, but remember, he should remember Tsar Nicholas I saying his best generals were generals January and February, or General Winter as we often call it. So Putin should have been aware of this, of the inclement weather difficulties, or indeed more of a difficulty for him was actually the spring being stuck in the mud. More arms for the Ukrainians could grind Russia down. I think it'd be wise not to do anything sudden or too drastic, which might make Putin lash out. There might be chemical weapons attacks on the Ukrainians. He might blow up a nuclear power plant deliberately to spread radioactivity. So some Ukrainian citizens have been supposedly able to steal Russian military vehicles which are broken down. So we don't want to panic Putin. That's why the United States says that regime change in Russia is not their objective, because Putin might think this is an existential threat to his regime. The nightmare that haunts him is what happened in East Germany when he was a KGB officer in Leipzig in 1989. A seemingly fairly robust communist regime fell very quickly indeed through popular discontent, the mass protests on the street. Or indeed Romania in 1989, a communist system, cult of the personality, and that was overthrown because of severe economic hardship. And that's the hardship he's actually bringing on his country right now. So he sees that obviously support is quite brittle. He's got to oppress people even more severely than ever before. He might no longer be able to guarantee people the necessities of life. So going back to the 1990s, of salaries not paid on time, of pensions whittled down, of hyperinflation, of mass unemployment, exactly what he doesn't want. The sort of disorder they saw in Kazakhstan in January this year. And already in some of the Ukrainian occupied cities, Ukrainian civilians are gallantly protesting against the illegal occupation. Now, the Russian troops have shown forbearance, but before long, it wouldn't surprise me if Putin said, you shoot dead these unarmed protesters and we'll just say they're armed terrorists, just like Putin's pals did in Kazakhstan and in Syria. So anyway, Putin says if Ukraine resists any longer, it'll no longer be an independent country, and that'll be their fault. Yet more projection. Exactly, ordinary Russian citizens suffered, it's not their fault, and reasonable, intelligent Russians I know, they believe this state propaganda, and why wouldn't they if that's all they hear? It'd be very, very difficult to resist that. You imagine the cognitive dissonance of having to face up to this, that you're told this all the time, but it's a big lie. And then saying, oh, the world is against this Russophobic hysteria. Now, I don't want there to be anti-Russian prejudice or prejudice against any nationality. But if there is anti-Russian prejudice, I wonder why that is. Why has that increased so much since 2014? So Zelensky's obviously trying to enlist the help of other countries, welcoming foreign volunteers for his military. Of course, according to the Geneva Convention, you are allowed to do that, and it wouldn't make those foreign countries co-belligerents in this war. But Zelensky says, well, who's next on the hit list? If they get away with this, they'll try and reconquer all the other communist states which are formerly under the heel of the Soviet Union. He wants to be the regional hegemon. Putin is quite open about that. He'll invade Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they're NATO states. Finland is not a NATO state. He can move on them. Russia already illegally occupies some of Moldova, could take more of that, all of that, could take all of Georgia, and on and on and on. And the Central Asian countries, they're getting jittery. Some of these Russian ultranational politicians say the Kazakhs have no tradition of statehood. Could they retake some of Kazakhstan, all of Kazakhstan? Who would come to their aid? And Azerbaijan, they made sure their ambassador was out of the room in the UN General Assembly when a vote was taken, so not to provoke the Ruskies. Anyway, I remember the late Robert Fisk saying wars are fought to test weapons, and no doubt the United States is watching eagerly to see how well their weapons perform against the Russians. This is more than a live fire exercise, so there's a sort of open-air laboratory. And so the Russians were too cocky about this. China's also watching closely. How does the West react? What if China tried to retake Taiwan? I bet the CIA was there in force in Ukraine, debriefing prisoners, gleaning all the information they possibly can. Well, it looks like a debacle from Russia, but though I think their numbers, their numerical superiority will mean that they shall prevail in the end. But at what cost? It must cost them $500 billion already in sanctions and all associated costs. We're only 11 days in. So I'd estimate that this conflict will go on till June at least. Remember, 13-day Georgia war, quite limited aims. Georgia is a tenth of the area of Ukraine, less than a tenth of the population. Plus, this is going very badly indeed. So far, there's been no blue on blue fire from either side, so far as I know. So the Ukraine needs to destroy its air bases before they fall to the Russians. Otherwise, the Russians will be able to fly things into them. The Ukrainians have made some errors as well, not blowing up bridges and stuff like that. So it's all deeply dispiriting. It was all utterly avoidable. It's all to do with Putin and his Camarilla. And sadly, well, the Russian Orthodox Church, they always speak up for the regime, and Kirill, the patriarch, will not speak up for peace. So God and Caesar are hand in glove there. So they teach submission to political authorities. Well, that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching. So please donate to me on PayPal. You'll find me at georgecallahan79@gmail.com. That's all small letters, GeorgCallahan79@gmail.com. Well, I estimate the Russians will take Kiev within about 5 days. Will Zelensky be killed? The world will react very badly to that if he is. If he's captured, he'll be a Nelson Mandela figure. He'll be a huge headache for Russia. People demand he's released. He'll no doubt be tortured or drugged into making some statement saying capitulate. If he was smart, he put out a statement saying, now, if you hear me say surrender, don't surrender. I'm doing it under duress. Fight on. Make this very painful, extremely costly for them, and they're forced to withdraw. Okay, thank you for watching, everyone. Goodbye.